Merry Christmas! What?
Ho, ho, ho.
It's Christmas Eve. Last week I ended and said that it was going to be Christmas when this came out. I was wrong. It is Christmas Eve when this comes out. So you probably are listening, because what else have you got to do on Christmas Eve?
What else?
Other than to spend lunch with your best friends, PB&J. And so, yeah, we're getting ready. Right now, when this comes out, we're going to be getting ready for our candlelight service at Connect Church. If you're in the Bolton area,
Come see us.
Come see us tonight at 5 o'clock. If you're listening to this on any other day than Christmas Eve, don't come at 5 o'clock, because we're probably not going to be there. All right? But if you're in Bolton, 5 o'clock, we're having a candlelight service at church. Our little traditional candlelight Christmas carols and Christmas stories, all warm and fuzzy. It's going to be nice. It's going to be nice. All right? But what's not so nice sometimes is this topic right here. We're gonna talk. People hate this. People hate this topic right here. There's a lot of it. Not everybody. Some people like it. Some people like it too much. Some people don't like it at all. What are we talking about? We're talking about husbands and wives and authority.
Submission to authority.
Ooh, buckle up, kids. It's going to be a good one. This is why we do this together. You're going to get a husband and wife perspective on what Peter is talking about here. What's interesting, so you know, and I'm sure you're aware, is that this is not the only place that this is talked about in the Bible.
Right.
Did you know that? It's actually quite a bit. It's referred to and talked about. And I'm sure I'm going to say it at some point, so I'm going to go ahead and say it now. The entire, what would it be? I don't want to say concept of marriage, principle of marriage, no. The state of marriage. What's the word I'm looking for?
I don't know.
What's God created? What God has put together. Somebody's saying
I know
it
what
right
you're
now.
talking
You're saying
about.
it right
Yeah.
now. Say it louder.
I was going to say the
I can't hear you.
ordained.
No, the institution of marriage.
Institution. We'll go with that.
Got it. We'll deal with that one. Don't leave it. All right. The institution of marriage is set up by God. All right. Husbands and wives set up by God. For this reason, a man will leave his mother and father and will be joined together, and the two shall become one.
That hurt.
Or one. All right. And I hugged her. For those of you that are listening and not watching, I didn't hurt my wife. I hugged my wife. My love for her is so strong it hurts sometimes. And so the institution of marriage is set up by God, ordained by God. He put it together, husband and wife, man and woman, put it all together, okay? And the structure of that marriage is that the husband is the head of the household. And I just lost some people on that statement, but I'm telling you, it is the structure that is set out throughout the Bible, that the man would be the head of the household. It does not, and then this is clarified, we're going to talk about it as we go through. It is clarified throughout Scripture that does not give the man permission to dominate over the woman, or to abuse the woman in any way or any form or fashion. And while there is a history of that throughout time, it's because of sin.
Yes.
So sin comes into the world, right? And as a result of that, pride and ego and all these things, and what the devil has done with so many things that God has created and ordained to be beautiful and good for us, the devil takes and twists and manipulates into something that is not good, so that man will reject it.
Right.
And I really feel like that's part of this idea in terms of roles within the marriage, where the man is supposed to be, the husband is the head of the household, the wife is in submission to the husband, and that is something that is so often rejected in the world today.
Right.
And as a result of that, so much of a rejection sometimes that people just completely go against the whole idea of the institution of marriage.
It's either completely rejected or it's so twisted and abused.
Yes.
It's like one or the other.
Yeah, people reject it, and that's what I mean. Is I was kind of joking in the beginning there, but there's some people that love this topic because they want to, as a husband, see, woman, you are to respect me and submit to me, and you're supposed to do what I say. And so there's some people that embrace this idea and go too far in that other direction because it's not as God, and we'll talk about this. that's not what God meant. That was not what God designed it to be. And then there's others that, reject the idea completely because it's like, well, I don't think that, as a wife, I don't receive the Bible's outdated, and, we don't have to, women are not inferior to men. There's nowhere in the Bible that says it's inferior. There's going to be something that's said today, and it's going to make it sound like some people take it to mean women are inferior to men. That's not what it's saying. And so I just want to preface all this by saying that, and the biggest thing is that I always say, I started to understand my relationship with Christ so much better after Joe and I got married. I was raised in church. I was raised in a Christian home. I accepted Christ as a kid and really committed and started following him as a teenager. It was just this thing of greater understanding. But it really wasn't until I got married that all of a sudden the relationship between me and Jesus really started to make sense. And the reason for that is because we read, as we're going to read here, you also read it in, I think Colossians talks about it. Yeah. Ephesians is probably the most famous passage on this, where it talks about, that wives are to submit to their husbands. As the church submits to Christ.
Don't take my notes.
All right. And then that husbands are to care for their wives as Christ cares for the church.
Right.
And so you see this thing of really, honestly, it's this thing where everybody is taken care of. And I heard somebody say this, I think it was probably Jimmy Evans in a marriage conference somewhere. But he always said, you do your verse, because oftentimes what you get is husbands and wives pointing at the other verses here. The husband pointing to the verse saying, you're supposed to submit to me. And the wives going, well, you're supposed to be like Jesus. When you start being like Jesus, I'll start submitting to you. And in reality, there's a great piece of advice that he says is, you do your verse. And he says that to both. If you will both each do your verse, both of your needs will be covered. Everything will be taken care of, and you will have such a love and a harmony and a unity, which is the same thing that Christ wants with us.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
That's a long context to come in, because I already know people have issues with this.
But that's okay.
It's okay.
Because I don't
talk about it.
I love how God wants to take us to a place where things that maybe we are uncomfortable with, He wants to change our hearts. And when we start to ask Him, God, reveal your word to me, change my heart, help me to understand things that are hard to do. And then when God does that, then you get what it was meant to be, and it works. It's good.
And so I want you to understand, I'm saying all this now, not because I'm trying to be defensive, but because I am trying to soften the walls built up around this topic. I'm trying to break those down a little bit so that you will be open to hearing what Peter is saying here. And
going back to how we started last week's, it goes to, that statement we started last week in verse 13, for the Lord's sake. Why are we talking about authority? Why are we about to talk about, submit to your husband? For the Lord's sake.
So let's do this. Ladies first.
Well, you got to read it.
Why do we do? No, I know. I'm just saying. We're going to deal with the wives first. Ladies first.
Okay.
That's all. So 1 Peter chapter 3. And we're going to read verses 1 through 6, and then we'll talk about it. So it says, in the same way, you wives must accept the authority of your husbands. Then, even if some refuse to obey the good news, your godly lives will speak to them without any words. They will be won over by observing your pure and reverent, by observing your pure and reverent lives. Don't be concerned with the outward beauty of fancy hairstyle and expensive jewelry or beautiful clothes. You should clothe yourselves instead with the beauty that comes from within, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is so precious to God. This is how the holy women of old made themselves beautiful. They trusted God and accepted the authority of their husbands. Made it sound like they had more than one husband. For instance, Sarah obeyed her husband Abraham and called him her master or Lord. You are her daughters when you do what is right without fear of what your husband might do.
Me first?
Sure.
So that the first couple of verses there, the 1 through 3, it stands out to me when it says, so in the same way, you wives must accept the authority of your husbands. And I feel like we kind of covered this last week, but it's this idea of you can't really go any further if you don't accept, going back to that, accept the authority of your husbands. If you don't accept that the authority of your husband is from God, it goes back to that word of what does it mean? It means to come under God's arrangement. Like God's the one that's created this. God's the one that's arranged this. And if you can't accept that, like it's just going to be hard. Yeah. It's going to be hard because your mentality is, and there's a lot of people today who have this mentality of, no, I just won't accept that. Right? I mean, there's a fight that where they just, I don't know, when we got married, I don't know why. Yeah. Maybe I had really good examples of what it looked like, but I had no problem accepting it. And I feel like that's a huge kind of first step.
Well, and I think too, to clarify, like, because this here, it starts off in the same way you wives must accept the authority of your husbands, then even if some refuse to obey the good news. So Peter's also talking about, because you might be listening, you might be watching, you might say, well, my husband, like, because Joy's saying, you have to understand that your husband's authority comes from God.
Right.
And you might say, well, my husband doesn't believe in God.
Right.
This goes back to the position.
Right.
It goes back to that position and how God structured the world to be and how God structured authority to be. And so God did that in such a way that even if those that are in certain positions, is the same thing as a government. Even if your government leader, prime minister, president, whatever, is even ungodly. If he's not godly, even if he is ungodly, refuses the message of the gospel, he is still in a position of authority. So we respect them not because they're godly. We respect them because God said to respect those in that position.
Right.
And so the same thing, what he's saying here to wives, is even if your husband is not a godly man, you are still to respect the authority that has been placed there by God because God has placed
But like
it.
Whether he's godly or whether he's not godly, in our culture right now, this is foolishness to our culture. Absolute foolishness to our culture. And so that's why I feel like, again, he is speaking to all wives, but he is making it that like, even like you're saying, even if they're not, even if they don't know God, they're not godly. But it's this thing of, I think that is that first step. You have to believe and understand that, okay, God, you ordained this. You created this. It's for your sake. You made the structure. Yeah. And I think that's like the first step to going, to understanding this. That next part where it says, even if some refuse to obey the good news, your godly lives will speak to them without any words. They will be won over by observing your pure and reverent lives. Like, I love that because, and I think I mentioned this before, it shows purpose. Like, it goes back to there is purpose in our respect for our husbands. There is purpose in the submission to our husbands, and the purpose is powerful. Like, the purpose is basically evangelistic.
Yeah.
Evangelistic. You're going to win them over by your godly lives, even when you don't say a word. I don't think it's wrong to speak up, right? It's not saying that there's times where God won't give you things to say, but it's this powerful idea where your very life is going to speak and be a testimony. And so I just love that, okay, I understand, okay, God, this is from you. You ordained this. You made it this way. And then the other factor is, not only did you make it this way, but you made it this way with a purpose, and you're going to use it, and it's evangelistic. And I just love the fact that God is giving hope to people who are in situations where they're like, my husband doesn't serve God, and yet God is he's giving a way, and he's giving a hope to evangelize to that person.
Yeah. And I think too, like, again, guess what, Joy?
What?
Context is everything. In case this is your first time ever listening, I'm a firm believer that context within the Bible and in life in general, context is everything. And so I think I'm going to keep reminding you of this as we go through. Like, everything Peter's talking about here is given within the larger picture of how a Christian is supposed to behave in a lost world.
Yeah.
And so just as Joy said, like there's a purpose in this. And the purpose is that we are to demonstrate the character of Christ in everything we do and in every relationship that we have. We are to demonstrate the character of Christ. Yeah. So whether your husband, so we're speaking to wives right now, so whether your husband is saved or not saved, whether he's a godly man or an ungodly man, we are to demonstrate the character of Christ. So you say, well, what if he's disrespectful to me? They were disrespectful to Jesus, and yet he loved them. Yeah. He never changed his character towards them. What if this? What if that? And like you can come up with all these different scenarios, and it was always this thing. You say, well, what if he's abusive? Do I have to stay in the home? You'll notice I actually read a story in church on Sunday. I'm going through the Gospel of John at our church, and at the end of it, it says that the crowd got angry, and they picked up stones to stone him to death. And it says that Jesus slipped away from the crowd and he hid. Yeah. So do I think that you need to leave if the husband's being abusive? 100% Jesus. It's character of Jesus. It wasn't his time. All right. I didn't preach it that way on Sunday. It just kind of came to me as I'm talking, but no. And so it's not that. Like, it's not that you stay in these horrible situations. It's just simply we are to demonstrate the character of Christ. So even if they are not demonstrating it towards you, we demonstrate it back. Why? As Joy said, it's evangelistic. It's that some might be one. So at this time, like when Peter's writing this as well, like Christians were very likely, they were being viewed as kind of challenging a lot of the social norms of that day and age. And actually under Roman law, the husband had absolute authority over all members of the house, including the wife. Nobody could make any decisions. There was no independence. There was no anonymity. There was just the husband. The husband was the only one that had any kind of a voice. And I think what's important to understand is that when the Bible talks about this idea of wives submitting to their husbands or accepting the authority, however it's worded in your translation, Peter and others are not encouraging this so that the husbands can dominate over them, right? But rather, again, to exemplify the character of Christ. And the same is going to be true of what Peter says about husbands' attitudes towards their wives in just a minute. Every single time the Bible talks about wives, it talks about husbands. Every time it talks about husbands, it talks about wives. It's never exclusive. It's always inclusive. It's always mutual of what the relationship is supposed to look like. And there are responsibilities on both sides. And it is never laid out to be this dominating relationship, but rather one that is set up in such a way that God can do what needs to be done.
Yeah, and it goes back to the idea too, or the scripture that says everyone will give an account to God. So it's this thing of I can't get to heaven and be like, well, God, he didn't do his verse. Yeah. He didn't love me like Christ loved the church. He didn't lay down his life for me. He didn't. That's not what I can say to God. God's going to look at my character. Yeah. And he's going to look at how what kind of wife I was. Did I do my verse, so to speak? So that's something to remember but it does mean that we're both going to give an account.
Right. And I think it's really important that you understand, again, this goes back to creation. Who did God created Adam first, and then he created Eve to come alongside him as a helpmate and as a partner. And it was very much a partnership in that, but it was Adam that was given the first word. And so even though Eve was the first one to eat of the fruit and the first one to sin against God, Adam was the one that was held responsible for it. And so they both suffered the consequences of it, but it was God did not come at Eve. He came at Adam. And he's like, well, where were you? Where were you in all of this? And so now, even though Eve was the first one to sin, the Bible says that the sins of the father are passed on to the son and to the children, to the next generation. Yeah. So this is the importance of the virgin birth. Yeah. Is why was the virgin birth so important? So that the sins of the father, the sins of Joseph, could not be passed on. Well, what about Mary? Wasn't she sinful? She was a human. Of course she had sin, and yet the sins of the father are the sins that are passed on. So the father it's laid out from Genesis all the way through the Bible that the father, the husband, is the head of the household, and there's a great responsibility that comes with that,
Right.
not to dominate or to rule, but to protect and to cover. And this has been the relationship all the way through. And I think that's why you see it in church today, even, that very rarely, very, very rarely do you see, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, this is rarely, do you see a married man come to church alone.
Yes.
Very rarely do you see a married man come to church alone. But
Even in our culture today.
And that's what I'm talking about. In our culture today, very rarely do you see a man come alone.
He generally brings his family.
He brings a family. When a man makes a decision to follow Jesus, he brings his family with him. However, our churches are filled with married women who attend alone.
Yeah.
Sometimes they have their kids, sometimes they don't. But churches today are filled with wives who come alone. And I think it's very indicative of this relationship, that God has designated from the beginning, that we see this, even no matter how much we fight against it, no matter how much we fight against it, no matter how much we speak out against the patriarchal society and it's a man-dominated thing. Yes, it's gone too far, but this is what happens with sin.
Yes.
When we don't take what God has given to us and bring it into submission under God's plan and God's purpose, then it gets out of whack and it becomes what it was never meant to be.
Abused.
And that's what I think we see, and that's where I feel like we see the breakdown in the families of today, is that, yes, it has become this male-dominated society, and it was never supposed to be male-dominated. It was supposed to be male-led, husband-led, but in a way that covered those that were
So that's an interesting thing that you say the word covered, because I don't know where I read this or I didn't even put it in my notes, but it's this idea that authority isn't done right. Authority done right is an act of covering for the people who come under it. So you think about, your kings and your government and your presidents, and done right, when they are leading, it should be an act of covering for the people.
Yeah.
So it's the same way with a husband and wife relationship. That's not a dominating or abusive understanding. When a husband, spiritually speaking, covers the home and leads it, and it has the authority over the home under God, like, it's a protection.
Yeah.
It is a covering, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Again, the world has messed it up.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's very hard for us to understand, but that's why we have to read the Bible and understand what God has done. Put the world aside because they've messed it up, and read it and understand what He has created, and it is that covering. Yeah.
And so, and then it goes on, and so he goes on in verse 3 and 4, talks about most beautiful, I'm just reading my notes. Don't be concerned about outward being of fancy hairstyles, expensive jewelry, or beautiful clothes. You should clothe yourself instead with the beauty that comes from within, an unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is so precious to God.
Yeah.
And I read that and I thought, Joy read a book one time years ago. And in the book, I don't know if you remember this, I can't remember what the name of the book was, and I'm not going to say it anyway because I don't want to endorse it. But in that context of the book was basically, you know what I'm talking about? It was basically instructing women that, you need to make yourself look a certain way for your husband.
Yeah.
That's what you need to do.
When he comes home, the barn better be painted.
Wow.
My southern roots came out.
Joy's North Carolina roots just came out right there. The barn better be painted. But it was this thing, I mean, to the point where I think it even said, if you need to go get some things done and made a little bigger, then that's what you need to do.
I read that book and felt horrible about myself.
Yeah, and so what Peter's going here is, listen, don't worry. It's more important that you come under this structure that God has laid out. That's the most important thing between husbands and wives. And so don't get caught up in this idea of, well, if I just look a certain way, then my husband will treat me better. If I just look a certain way, then I'll win. If I just look a certain way, then I can have more say and more this and that. And he's like, no, listen, what you need to do, you just need to worry about what's your character like. What is your character like? All this is just fluffiness.
Once when we were dating, Ben made me go to Walmart in my pajama pants and no makeup on and my hair not done. Because when we first started dating, I was all into like, I got to look a certain way, I got to have my hair done. And he was trying to free me of that. So he literally took me to Walmart in my pajama pants. Yeah, I was a Walmart person.
I had to break her. She's gorgeous. She's gorgeous. With or without makeup, she is gorgeous. And I remember I surprised her one time. I flew in, didn't tell her I was coming. We lived in different places. I flew in to visit. I walked in the house. I was waiting in the kitchen. Her dad went and got her. She comes in. She screams.
And rollers.
She screams at me, runs into her bedroom,
rollers.
Slams the door and yells, "What are you doing here?" And then I had to go sit awkwardly on the couch for an hour while she got did. She had to go paint the barn. And so then after that, I was like, you know what, girl, you
be free in the name of Jesus.
Beautiful. Be free. The most beautiful thing in the world is a godly character. And like, I even thought with that, like even in terms of, for those of you that may be listening, watching, and you're not married yet, mm-hmm. like, can I just say, if you think you got to look a certain way to catch a person,
mm-hmm. Good luck.
Like you're going to, listen, you're going to catch something, but it may not be what you want.
Right.
If that's what's going to catch them is the way that you look and not the way that you are, then you may catch something that you probably want to throw back later.
I have these conversations with Isaac. You don't want a high maintenance girl, Isaac.
Find a girl who's comfortable in sweats.
No,
wears a hat.
When I read this and he's talking about, don't be concerned about the outward beauty, fancy hairstyles, expensive jewelry. Like we could add to that list, right? We could be like Botox, boob jobs, $400 creams, right? There's tons more that we could add to the list these days, right? But what he's saying, he's not saying that those things are wrong or sin. He's saying don't concern yourselves. Don't get distracted with that. Because it's things, and I get this because I feel like it's so easy to kind of go one way or another. And I'm a little bit of a person who, again, it's not wrong to go shopping and get the latest outfits. These things are not wrong. But I kind of have chosen to purposely stay out of that world because it distracts me. I start to kind of go down a road where I start to feel bad about myself, and I start to think, oh, is that what makes you beautiful? Is that what he wants? Is that what I'm supposed to be? Because your culture will tell you this, and this. And so for myself, I kind of stay out of it altogether.
Yeah.
But basically, Paul here is saying, don't get distracted by those things. Like, again, the culture is, there's a certain show out there about wives that I'm sure you know of, everybody knows of, and they made 12 dozen of these shows.
They're desperate.
In every city.
They're desperate for attention.
And this particular show, like, not only, is everything just fancy hairstyles, makeup, all this, but if you go on, which we haven't gotten there yet, or maybe we have. Yes, we have. But it goes back to what is God looking for? Okay, so if it's not the outward, what is God looking for? It's talking about where should we find our beauty? We should find our beauty from within, and it's an unfading beauty, and it comes from a gentle and quiet spirit. And I know that's like a joke, talking about that show or whatever. But it's the thing of like, it's not a joke. This is what our world chases after.
Yeah.
This is what people are chasing after, is that lifestyle. And so it's all outward, and it is not a gentle spirit and that quiet spirit. And also, just side note, when he says gentle and quiet spirit, we have to understand, like, he's not talking about volume. Like, it's not a volume issue. It's a spirit issue.
Yeah.
So when you say quiet spirit, it means tranquil. It means peaceful. So what is beautiful is that spirit that's at peace. It's not anxiety. It's not fear. It's not worry.
Well, and also one that's not causing,
a
lack of peace within the home.
Yeah.
So it's not an argumentative spirit.
Yeah.
It's not, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's just this, just understanding and clarify. It's not a volume thing.
Yeah.
It's a spirit thing.
Yeah.
And so I look and see what the world is offering, and Peter's like, don't get distracted by the world.
And again, listen, We'll say it again, all right? Because sometimes we say things and people like jump on one part of it, and so we're gonna over clarify some things here. Again, those things are not wrong. They're not sinful. It's just not what makes a great wife.
Yeah. Yeah. And
I think that's important to understand. Like, that is not what makes a great wife. You are not a great wife because when your husband walks in the door at the end of the day, you got the barn painted, your hair's done, and we're not looking for that 1950s June Cleaver kind of deal. Like, that's not what makes you a great wife, and the food being on the table, or like, it's not that. It's not, whether you're out earning money for the home as well. It's not, those are not the things that make you a great wife, or even say it this way, it's not what makes you a biblical wife.
Yeah.
It's not what makes you a wife after God's plan for marriage.
Right.
He says, this is how the holy women of old made themselves beautiful. They trusted God and accepted the authority of their husbands. That's how they made themselves beautiful. And so it's this character. It comes back to the character again of God. Like the most, it's that attractiveness. I think we're both this way. There's an attractiveness that we, sorry, y'all, little TMI for you. There's an attractiveness that we feel for one another when you hear them talking about God. I love to hear Joy talk about the Word of God. I love to hear Joy talk about Jesus when she's passionate about her faith, and no matter who she's talking to, there's an attractiveness there. There's a glow that comes over her, and I believe it's because it's just she trusts God. She trusts God. And so, and then it goes on and says, for instance, Sarah obeyed her husband and Abraham and called him her master. Other translations say her Lord, which just means that she recognized his authority as her husband. Yeah. And says, you are her daughters when you do what is right without fear of what your husbands might do. And that statement is, again, it kind of goes back to what we talked about last week with the in the slaves and masters, is this thing of you don't do because of how you're treated. You do because for the sake of the Lord. Right. Right. And so how are you able to, some people might say, you don't know my husband, you don't know what he's like, you don't know how he treats me, and all those things. And so how am I supposed to submit to his authority? And this is what Peter says, is you do it without fear of what your husband might do. In other words, your trust is always, even if I'm the best husband that's ever walked the face of the earth, all right, Joy's faith is not in me. Right. It is in God. Right. No matter what, in good times and in bad, that's what carries you through. And that's what allows you to stay in that position that God wants you to be in all of these scenarios, whether it's with government authority, whether it's with your employees, employer relationships, whether it's your husbands and wives, whether it's with other believers.
Can I give an example too that I feel like fits with that of in the don't be fearful? So remember Esther, where, she, so I don't know if you know the story of Esther or not, but so God puts her in this position at a time where he uses her to save the Jewish people. But she has to do something very daring and bold, and if she was not in tune with God, like she would have missed it. So it's this thing where she literally she breaks the law when she goes and she talks to her husband, the king. So he's the king, and when she speaks to him, she basically in that moment was breaking the law. But she had to do what was right instead of fear of her husband. Yeah. Right. So that was a situation where she honored her husband. She honored the king in every way. But in this one thing, she literally had to break the law and follow God without fear of what her husband would do. Right. That's good. And it worked out. Yeah.
It's funny. Yeah. I just, as I was making my notes on this, as I was studying for this episode, a song was actually playing in the background. It's one of those things, I'm in the middle of writing these notes in particular out, and all of a sudden I start hearing the words of the song that was playing, literally as I'm reading this last verse of, do this without fear of what your husband might do. There's a song that comes on by Maverick City, and the name of the song is God Will Work It Out. You're like, all right. And so this is in every situation, scenario, circumstance, we put our faith is first and foremost in God, always in God first. And why? How can we do that? We do that because we believe God will work it out.
Yeah.
God will work it out. God will work it out. And so we submit to that authority, and we trust. And even if it's not reciprocated, even if it's not where it needs to be, even if that other person doesn't have the character of Christ towards us, we continue to exhibit the character of Christ towards them in the hopes that not only will it win them to Christ, but we can do that in confidence and faith, knowing God will work it out. We don't have to fear of repercussions.
And so to go back to that part where it says, for instance, Sarah obeyed her husband, but the part where it says, you are her daughters when you do what's right without fear of what your husbands might do. So I thought this verse was really cool, because you know how it's called, so we know Abraham is the father of our faith, but also for us women, for us wives, like Sarah is our mother, right? And it says, you're her daughters if you do what's right without fear. So I thought that comparison was really cool, because it's so many times where it talks about Abraham's the father of our faith, So to see this example of Sarah here was really cool to me. And it just kind of clicked in of like, that's true, because of looking at Sarah's life. And you often look at Abraham's life and his faith and his journey with God, but look at Sarah's life and in being obedient and submissive in all those situations. And there was some times where it got a little sketchy, where, hey, this is my sister, this is not my wife, this is my sister. And like, she was put in some situations that if she didn't trust God, that would have been really, these things were hard. These things were situations where not everything was easy. I mean, imagine when Abraham said, pack up everything, Sarah, we're leaving. We're going to this new land. I don't know where we're going, but we're packing up. And she followed him. And so I even look at my own life of situations where, I can see it in his eyes. I can tell, okay, we're about to move, right? and just what's amazing though is when God brings you together in unity, like he changes my heart as well. But I could choose to have fear of, oh goodness, what's he going to do, or what's going to happen, or what, it's that fear based, or I can choose to trust God. And I think it's interesting when you're looking at the fear, because in the beginning, what is it that makes us beautiful? What is it that God is looking for? It says he's looking for gentle and quiet spirit. And so to me, that's that peaceful spirit versus what is he telling us? Stop, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And so to me, you see the contrast, and it's so easy for myself anyway. I guess I shouldn't speak for all women, but like to have fear in my life over things and situations and anxieties. And so there's this call to trust God and do what's right and not have fear. Yeah. God's going to take care of you.
Yeah. Now the husbands. Wives got 6 verses. Husbands get 1. All right. And this is the verse. Verse 7 says, in the same way. Let me just stop. In the same way. In other words,
break it down. These
are not mutually exclusive instructions. All right. So he has just given these instructions to the wives, and in the same way. That's the next verse. It's a continuous statement. So just as wives, this is what the expectation is. This is the instruction to you. In the same way, husbands, this is how you should be.
In other words, you don't get off the hook.
Right. All right. So in the same way, you husbands must give honor to your wives. Treat your wife with understanding as you live together. She may be weaker than you are, but she is your equal partner in God's gift of new life.
Stop. Let's arm wrestle now.
Let's do it. Let's prove a point. Treat her as you should, so your prayers will not be hindered. It's just it's this simplicity, and again in other places. So in Ephesians especially, there's a lot more instruction given to the husbands.
Right.
And our role is to be as Christ is to the church. And so I think a couple of things to take away from this. And number one, like submission in marriage So it talked about wives submitting to the authority of the husbands, but understanding submission in marriage is a mutual thing, and it begins with both people submitting to Christ. And so as we submit to Christ, then the other roles just kind of fall into place, because we understand that there's a responsibility that we have. There are roles that we are supposed to play. And so and I think that's why Peter's instructions here are even so brief. It's just like, in the same way, guys, you husbands, honor your wives. Treat them like you should. In other words, Peter's like, I don't even need to go into detail about all this, because y'all already know what you're supposed to do, so just do it. Just shut up and do it, all right? Do you believe in Jesus? Are you submitted to Jesus? Then treat your wives the same way that Jesus treated the church. And these are things that were written in other letters, and so these are things that the church already knew about. And it's understanding, like, treat your wife with understanding as you live together.
Yeah.
It's this idea of recognizing, too, like, that wife that you have is a gift from God. That wife that you have is the daughter of God. She's God's child, and God does not like when his daughters get mistreated, right? And so you even see it at the end of that verse is, treat her as you should, so your prayers will not be hindered.
That was a heavy one, yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
Guys, listen. Like, you understand that? Like, this is what he's saying here is if you don't treat your wife the way that you're supposed to, if you're not loving her as Christ loved the church, if you're not treating her with the respect, the honor, if you're not giving her honor, all right, in the way that you're supposed to, then it says, like, God, and other translations, it says your prayers can't be heard. Like, God's not even going to listen to you
But
anymore.
imagine, like, none of us want to be cut off from God, right? Like the visual there of, I can't even hear you. That's powerful.
We are, and so I wrote here, like, what does it look like when we say that we are to love our wives as Christ loves the church? Christ pursued us. He pursued us. He came after us. You know, he left heaven and came to earth. He went to places where other people had never gone before. Like, he did all of these things, and he pursued mankind. Husbands, are you pursuing your wives? Are you giving honor to her, or is it this, no, I'm the one in authority, I'm the one in leadership, and so she needs to do to me, she needs to submit to me, she needs to take care of me, she needs to, like, do you come home at the end of the day, kick your feet up, and expect to be served all the time? Or are you showing honor? Are you pursuing your wife? You know, or is it just this one-way street of she needs to come to me, she needs to do for me, she needs to respect me, she needs to do, like, what did the example of Christ look like? He pursued us.
Yeah.
He came after us. He came looking for us. He loved us unconditionally. Right? It didn't matter how much rejection that we felt and got, how much rejection we showed him, or how much rejection came at Christ. He still loved unconditionally.
And he loved us before we loved him.
Before we loved him. He gave his life for us before we knew we needed it.
Right.
Right? He took care of our needs before we even knew what we needed. Like, how attentive are you to the needs of your wife? How attentive are you to that in terms of that loving pursuit of your wife? Like, there is a huge responsibility. There's a huge responsibility that we as men have. And it's not this, like, so often we fall into the stereotypes of, you know, and both of us, Joy and I both, get super annoyed with all the jokes between husbands and wives, and, like, the stereotypes from movies and television and all that stuff, and just the, you know, if you forget a birthday, well, oh, you're in the doghouse now, you better buy flowers and all this stuff, and it's like we get caught into those
Culture.
The cultural norms, right? We get caught up in all of those things. And even for some people that maybe grew up in a different culture where wives are seen as less than, like, as a Christian, you are no longer citizens of this earth. You are citizens of heaven.
Right.
So you can't see it. You can't blame culture on how you treat your wife.
Right.
Right? You can't blame culture for, well, in our culture, no, not anymore.
Right.
All right? It doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter where you're born, doesn't matter what culture your family is a part of. None of that matters anymore.
Yeah.
You are a citizen of heaven. And so you act as
Or
Jesus
the
acts.
examples that you were raised with.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. All of those things. None of that can be used as an excuse. If you are submitted to the authority of Christ, then you are to act as Christ acted. You are to submit to his authority. And so, and even that idea, he gave all, even in the face of rejection. And so it comes back, and again, as men, as husbands, we have got to get to this place where we recognize our example is Jesus. So even as wives are called to display the character of Christ towards their husbands, we are called to love our wives as Christ loved the church. And he gave everything. He gave everything. He pursued, he loved, he gave his life.
And this is why when you see it in the fullness of how God structures this, you see like it's this understanding of how powerful it is and how much it works.
Yeah.
I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And I think again, like it's an overwhelming responsibility, I feel like, when you truly grasp a hold of what this looks like.
Yeah.
Christ came to give an example. He said, when you see me, you've seen the Father. So the question here, guys, again, if our role is to be as Christ is to the church, then when our wives look at us, they should see God. They should see God in us. Because that's what Jesus said. He said, when you look at me, when you look at me, this is what he told the disciples. When you look at me, when you see me, you've seen the Father.
Yeah.
And so when your wives look at you, do they see the Father? Do they see God in you? Like that's the example. That's the character that we are supposed to portray to our wives, to our families. That's a heavy responsibility. We are to lead. What did Jesus do? Jesus came to lead the way for humanity back to God. Are you in your home as husbands? Are you leading your family towards God? Are you leading your wives towards God? How are you doing that? How are you doing it? It's time. Like I want to see men.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get a little ranty here.
He's gonna start preaching.
All right. I want to start seeing men that lead their homes as Christ led the church. I want to see men that will stand up and go, "This is the way to my Father." I want to see men that take the spiritual responsibility in the home and not pass it off to the women and not pass it off to the wives and go, well, you can have all of that. I'm going to go out and I'm going to win. I'm going to go out and provide. All right. A husband's responsibility is not simply to provide food and shelter for their wives. A man's responsibility is to love as Christ loved the church. And the first responsibility that Christ had was spiritual. All right. We trust God for provision. All right. So I'm going to go and I'm going to work my tail off and I'm going to do everything I can to provide physically and practically for my family. But the most important responsibility I have is that my wife sees the Father in me and wants more of God. And like she said, that's why it becomes easy. We don't see it. You don't see it as this patriarchal society where, oh, I'm a wife and so therefore I'm less than because I'm a woman. You don't see that. You look and go, oh my goodness, he loves me and cares for me and protects me and is leading me and is wants nothing but the best and is trying to find purpose for our family and for our marriage and is protecting that and all of these things. And therefore, man, I will follow him anywhere.
Right.
And at the same time, I'm going to go because I love you, because I see the character of Christ in you. Man, I want you to come with me everywhere I go. Let's do this thing
Makes
together.
me think of Jesus, though. So it's this thing of when I submit myself to Jesus and I sacrificially serve him or love him, how do I do that? So how do I do that? How do I, it's not always easy in the sense of easy, but it comes naturally because when I look at what Jesus did for me, you gladly give your life. So it's the same, it should be the same in that husband and wife relationship of the sense of it coming easy because my word, you lay down your life for me, you do. So it's that thing where it comes naturally. Yeah.
And so how do we lay our lives down for our families now? It's just, they take priority. Our wives take priority over everything, even over your kids. Like, listen, again, I think I've seen fathers that will spend so much time with their kids and yet they neglect their wives or they will spend, it's almost like They laugh at, like my kids know now, like if they disrespect their mother, they're going to deal with daddy about that. All right. That's my wife. It's your mother and you need to respect your mother. Well, that's my wife. She was here before you were. And one day you're going to move out of my home and I'm still with her. All right. Listen, you will respect her. You will respect her or you will deal with this right here. All right. Listen, we got to let you go. We still didn't finish everything we said we were going to finish 2 weeks ago, but we're going to stop. And I would say this to kind of sum up husbands and wives. The goal is never to win the argument. The goal is to win your spouse. Win them. And how do you win them? You love them as Jesus loves them, and you trust God with the rest.
And if I could go back to the statement of why do we do this? Why do I follow after this verse and he follows after his verse? Why do we do this? We do this for God's sake. And he is going to make it worth it when we follow him and we do what's right.
Love you.
I love you, but we're on video, so we can't make out right now.
We're going to turn this video off then.
TMI.
All right, get out of here. No.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, guys. Happy Christmas Eve. Again, if you're around the Bolton area, come see us. If it's not Christmas Eve when you watch this or listen to it, stay home. All right. But outside of that, we really do. We hope you guys have already had a Merry Christmas, or we hope you have a Merry Christmas. And we will see you next week on New Year's Eve. We will celebrate the new year with you. Or the beginning, just the day before. You get the point. Anyway, that's it for today. Have a great time with friends, family. Love one another. All right? As Christ loves you, show that love to everybody that you're around. Celebrate Jesus in this season. And have a great time. Eat some turkey for us, too. All right? We're going to do it. Bye. It's time to go. Leftovers with lunch.
Turn that thing off.
All right. We'll see you. Lunch with PB&J. Bye.